Welcome everyone. My name is Samantha Oakley from ALA's Public Programs Office. I'm pleased to introduce today's webinar, Post-Truth, Fake News, and a New Era of Information Literacy. Before we start, I'd like to make a few quick announcements. Today's webinar is presented by the Public Programs Office with support from ALA's Cultural Communities Fund. To learn more about the Cultural Communities Fund or make a contribution, visit ala.org/ccf. Hopefully, many of you are familiar with Programming and Librarian, a website of ALA's Public Programs Office. We have a lot of program ideas and an online learning library full of free webinars like this one. Finally, a couple of notes about our virtual classroom. Only our presenter has microphone access, but you are welcome to type your questions or comments in the chat box. We will have time for Q&A at the end. Also, if you have any technical issues, please send a private message to Colleen Barbas. To do so, hover over Colleen's name in the upper right-hand corner of your screen and click Start Private Chat. Now I'd like to introduce our presenter, Dr. Nicole Cook. Nicole is the MSLIS Program Director and Assistant Professor at the School of Information Sciences at the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana. Her research and teaching interests include human information, critical cultural information studies, and diversity and social justice in librarianship. Nicole has won multiple awards and honors throughout her career. Most recently, she was recipient of the 2016 ALA Equality Award and was named one of Library Journal's 2007 Movers and Shakers. This year, Nicole is the recipient of the Achievement in Library Diversity Research Award from ALA's Office for Diversity, Literacy, and Outreach Services. Today, we are proud to have Nicole join us to talk about fake news and a new era of information literacy. Now I'd like to turn things over to Nicole.
Okay, thank you, Samantha and Colleen, and the team for the invitation and facilitating this webinar today. And so, as Samantha said, I'm here to chat with you a little bit about fake news, and so these are just a few of the topics that we'll be covering today. This idea that fake news isn't really new, just has a new name. I will also give you a couple of definitions just to frame the conversation, not to, make you feel like we're having a lesson of some sort, and really just wanting to talk about the emotions behind information consumption and how that plays a role into the spread and perpetuation of fake news. Also talk a little bit about the economics of information choice, metaliteracy, and then I'll spend some time discussing with you a workshop that we held here at the iSchool Illinois and tell you how that went and share some examples with you about that. So, fake news or fabricated news is expressly disseminated for the sake of earning money from clicks and views, and it is also used to mislead and derail, unfortunately. With lightning speed, fake news can go viral without being vetted or confirmed. And if such information is ever retracted or disproved, the damage has already been done and the evidence remains digitally archived. This scenario played out repeatedly and in epic proportions in the months leading up to the 2016 presidential election. Now, post-election, increasing attention is being paid to fake news. But fake news is not really new, nor are its relatives, hoaxes, satire, algorithmic biases, and propaganda. It just really has an alarming new patina to it. So our chat today will address the renewed phenomenon of fake news and discuss how knowledge of information behavior and metaliteracy skills can aid LIS professionals and the public in combating the effects of fake news. It is now being said that we live in a post-truth era, an era in which audiences are more likely to believe information that appeals to emotions or existing personal beliefs, as opposed to seeking and readily accepting information that might be otherwise regarded as factual and/or objective. Post-truth is assumed to be among the reasons that fake news has taken such a hold, and subsequently among the reasons it's so hard to fight back and disrupt the production and dissemination of deliberately false information. So just like fake news is not a new phenomenon, neither is the concept of post-truth. If any of you were fans of the Colbert Report, you'll know that Stephen Colbert introduced us to the word truthiness almost a decade ago. And when we're talking about truthiness, again, thinking about how people prefer concepts and facts that appeal to their emotion as opposed to things that are strictly factual. So post-truth and truthiness both emphasize the fact that there are a wide range of motivations and motivations that underlie our everyday information seeking, information selection, information avoidance, and information usage. And these are all part of the information behavior continuum or process. So information behavior is all about context. Information and facts don't exist in a vacuum. Rather, they are surrounded and shaped by contexts of all kinds, both internal and external. So now I just want to give you two definitions to kind of further frame this discussion. When we're talking about fake news, we're really talking about instances of misinformation and disinformation. And so misinformation, this could really just be stories that make the rounds on social media, also appears in print and broadcast media, and it's just something that's false, right? So you could have a story that's happening and a lot of it could be true, but there could be some elements that are false or misleading, and it may or may not be intentional, but it is false nonetheless. When we move into the idea of disinformation, this is where we're getting more into the fake news realm. Disinformation implies that the information is purposely created to mislead or deceive. So this is where we're getting things like propaganda. We also get now, I'm sure you've all heard of alternative facts. So some of these things are deliberately created to promote a particular agenda or promote a particular point of view. And so just like fake news is not new, if you think back to propaganda, which is information especially of a biased or misleading nature used to promote a political cause or point of view. Propaganda is also associated with the psychological mechanisms of influencing and altering the attitude of a population towards a specific cause, position, or political agenda in an effort to form a consensus to a standard set of beliefs. So this sounds a lot like fake news and what we're currently experiencing in various forms of media. And just to continue on with this point of this is not new, right? We've been dealing with the National Enquirer for decades, right? False headlines, gossip, sensational stories, and things of that nature. So none of this is new, and it certainly is not new just because we now have various social media platforms. The second image that just popped up, this is a website that I was actually using in the early 2000s when I was doing library instruction sessions. And at this point, this particular site, martinlutherking.org, is a fake site, and it's actually run by Stormfront, which is a white supremacy organization. And even in the early 2000s, when we were just talking about website literacy and how to tell a quality website from a false website or a lower quality website, all of these things still apply. Right, so I'm actually surprised this website is still up, but it is. But just to say that we, as librarians and information professionals, have been doing this work for many, many years. And this is just another quick example of a clickbait headline, right? And so this is a couple that has a show on HDTV, very popular couple, and they're going through a divorce, and so there's all sorts of gossip and things going on around that. And so this was actually an advertisement, and a couple things really quickly that I just want to point out. This picture is implying that she is a victim of domestic abuse. You'll see this very poorly done Photoshop of a black eye that she has. And then the sensational headline, why they really split, she finally speaks up. And also you'll notice that there's a very small, inaccurate logo for the Today Show. So if you're just moving through social media quickly, as we tend to do, you might click on that, right? Because you're seeing something that looks visually familiar to you, and you might want to know what is the real story. So again, all of this fake news, not new, just various forms, different names. So In terms of getting into the information behavior of it all, there are a couple of different things that I just want to mention to you in terms of why audiences, why we ourselves are susceptible to fake news. And one of them is confirmation bias. And so confirmation bias is what is happening in this comic that you see on the screen here. And it's this idea that we look for news, we look for information that confirms what we already know, what we already believe, right? So if we see something in our feeds, on our televisions, listening to something on the radio that makes sense to us, we don't necessarily feel the need to go any further because we have been validated and our beliefs have been confirmed. So that's confirmation bias. Another thing that happens with confirmation bias is something called a filter bubble. And it's this idea that we tend to look for things that, again, confirm our existing beliefs, and we don't necessarily go outside of that. So we all have our particular news channels and radio shows and print media, things that we tend to go back to over and over again because that's what we're comfortable with, right? So there are perhaps other sources and other channels that we avoid because we're not comfortable with them, right? So this is the filter bubble, and you might also hear this referred to as an echo chamber as well. Part of the reason that filter bubbles and echo chambers are so prevalent is this idea of repetition theory. And that's really just the idea that the more you hear something, the more you believe it. So if there's a particular point of view that you are exposed to over and over and over again, then you're going to tend to believe it, right? And then that makes it even more difficult to break outside of that filter bubble or that echo chamber. Now, when we're dealing with fake news, another of the reasons why this becomes an issue to try and combat this is simply information overload. We are inundated with information all day, every day. And it becomes even an unconscious mechanism about how we interact with the information and how we sort through information. We may not even be aware, that we're automatically filtering out certain things, but we have to because we can't deal with just the sheer amount of information that we're presented with on a daily basis. As part of that coping mechanism, there is going to be some information avoidance. Information avoidance is simply there is information that we choose not to engage with, right? Some of this can be unconscious and some of this could be very purposeful. For example, I will not watch ABC channel or XYZ channel because I don't agree with what their commentators or their personalities are saying. That is information avoidance. And finally, I just wanted to mention the idea of satisficing to you. And satisficing is also related to the cartoon on the screen. I saw the first result and it matched exactly what I thought, and so I'm satisfied now. I don't have to continue looking for additional information. And so I think with the fake news, satisficing also becomes a problem because we may not necessarily be motivated to look for anything further, to actually do more research when we're presented with false information. When we're talking also about information overload, I just wanted to present this particular image to you and just make note of the sheer amount of resources that we are exposed to. So print resources, broadcast media, and a whole assortment of information that is then funneled through social media. So we have lots of choices. And so this particular image was created by Vanessa Otero, and if you download the PDF, the link to her post on Facebook is there, and you'll see that there's a lot of contention even in the discussion about this image because people have different feelings about different sources and where they think they should be on this particular graphic. People have different opinions about what they consider liberal or conservative or gossip or satire, etc. So this idea that we think we have so many different choices, but lots of sources do the same thing. Lots of resources are owned by the same parent companies, right? So we think we have a lot of choice, but the choices are perhaps fewer than we realize. And as I mentioned, we have all of these sources, and a lot of what's happening with the fake news is that these sources are then funneled through Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, other social media channels. And we're seeing a lot of information really quickly, and we're sharing and we're liking and we're doing all of these things and not absorbing the information in the same way that we might if we were reading a hard copy of a newspaper or sitting down and actually watching the nightly news on whatever channel. So we're consuming information in a different way as well. And as I mentioned, in terms of liking and sharing, another dimension of having all of this information available to us via social media is this idea of instant gratification, right? We see it right away. We can like the information right away. We can share the information right away. And we're even starting to see that with some of the news channels and sources. They want to be the first to break news or the first to issue a story to their viewers. And so when we're sharing information and sharing these stories, it is very likely that people are sharing information and stories without actually doing more than reading the headline or the title, right? We're not actually clicking to go deeper to see if this story is credible, if it comes from a good place or not. All right, and this is just another example, another graphic of the filter bubble. All right, particularly as we're looking through social media platforms. When we're talking about our feeds, whether it's Twitter, Facebook, etc., we also need to consider the algorithms behind it, right? Most of us probably have very curated lists of friends or acquaintances that we have on social media, and you tend to pick people perhaps that think like you, and therefore you're creating even more of a filter bubble because you've got like news, you've got similar news to what you might already be drawn to, and that is what is creating and coming up most often on your feeds. And again, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, just this idea that now with the fake news, we have this added dimension of political economy. And by political economy, just that there's a whole cottage industry now of fake news. There have been some articles on NPR and some other places where they have actually interviewed people whose job it is to generate these fake stories, and they're doing it for a profit. They are making a living on generating this false content. So that is another dimension of why it's so difficult to combat, because there's just so much of it, because we have so many false content creators. So in terms of what we as library and information professionals can do, I want to just present this idea of metaliteracy. Some of you may have heard of this. And you know, there are articles on multiliteracy, other types of literacy, but I want to just focus specifically on metaliteracy as presented by Mackey and Jacobson. So this is a screenshot from their 2011 article, but they also have a book of the same name that came out in 2014. And so they're really suggesting that we have lots of different discrete types of literacy. So, for example, LIS professionals focus on information literacy, but there's also media literacy, digital literacy, computer literacy, and all of these other types of literacy. So instead of looking at one in isolation, metaliteracy is encouraging us to look at literacy holistically and think more about how do we become better critical thinkers, better critical consumers in respect to all types of information. In fact, Mackey and Jacobson refer to the goal as being that we should be wanting to create meta-literate learners. And they say that the meta-literate learner is an active participant who is an effective communicator and translator of information. So they're really saying that what we're doing is hopefully encouraging our students and our patrons to become active consumers and move beyond that passive consumption of information. So I'll just spend the next couple of minutes talking to you about the fake news workshop that we had here at the iSchool, Illinois. Myself and a couple of my colleagues from the iSchool and also from the university's Department of Journalism, we ran a workshop. We had almost 100 people in person and online. Again, really hot topic. People want to know how to better engage with information, particularly as it pertains to fake news. And so one of the things that we talked about, and these are things that I'm sure as librarians that you all know, is how to move past fake news, right? So just very basic tips about how to triangulate your information. Are you only seeing it in one place, or are you seeing it in multiple places from multiple sources? We talked a lot about reading outside your own filter bubble, checking your own biases, the lenses through which you view information. As I mentioned to you earlier, knowing the difference between propaganda, satire. We still have to have lots of conversations with people about The Onion, right, which is a satire website, however plausible their headlines may be sometimes. And we also talked about some usual suspects in terms of sources that you might consult to kind of combat this false information, like Snopes, PolitiFacts, factcheck.org. And again, this is by no means a comprehensive list, but just a way to get people started. And again, along those lines, we talked a lot about how to examine sources. Actually clicking past the headline, right? Going outside of the social media platform to view the information. Is the language inflammatory? Can you get information about the particular source? Is there a date attached? Are there citations? So just kind of some things that we are more used to doing when we do information literacy instruction, but just trying to drive some of those points home. In the workshop, after we had some of this discussion, we ran a quiz with them. There are lots of sites online where you can, quiz your knowledge about fake news. And so this one in particular, just a set of 7 questions, a series of different headlines, and working with the audience to say, which one of these headlines do you think is the fake news headline? So it's a nice way to get people started and get people thinking about what they're looking at. So this is another example that we showed them. We wanted to get more involved with the idea of visual literacy. So just really quickly, and I'm just going to ask you to type in the chat box, what do you think this picture is? What do you think is happening here? Okay, so, lots of answers at once. I see protests, I see Photoshop. It looks like someone's making out during a riot. That the man is trying to pick the woman up out of a riot. Okay, Sarah knows a little bit more about this story. Vancouver post-Stanley Cup riots. All right. Yes, so another one for Photoshop. Taking a nap during a riot. Yes, yes. Okay, so lots of different things when we all are looking at the same image. So if I could ask Colleen to play the video clip for me. Okay, thank you. So what we have here is something a little bit different than what it appears to be in this still photograph. So, as was mentioned in the chat box, this was a riot, if you will. I know some people prefer the term uprising. Something that happened after a hockey game, and I believe they were celebrating a win. And so this is what was happening. So this young couple who looks like they're having some type of romantic encounter, or, you know, some type of more idyllic idea of, you know, what's happening in the midst of chaos. This couple was actually knocked down by the crowd and by police in riot gear. And so I have some examples on, or links, if you will, to read more about this example, including a link to an interview by the actual couple. And she was actually injured, and he was trying to comfort her. So he was kissing her, but he was trying to kiss her on the forehead to comfort her in that way. And if you go through that video in its entirety, at some point then you see people standing over them and helping them up. And so it becomes a very different story. Again, context matters in this particular case. When you get more pictures, when you see the whole video, the context becomes very different. And so we were able to spend maybe about 15 or 20 minutes with the audience really trying to dissect this photo and really going to the video, going to some other resources, and really just adding more and more context and talking about what it means to be viewing things in isolation, and what that means to being susceptible to false or fake information. So I wanted to end really with just giving you another resource. So this is a Pinterest board, for those that are familiar with Pinterest, of all of the different examples that I've collected really in the last couple of months. And I have another file with literally over 400 resources. So to say that fake news is a big topic is really not an understatement. And so this board, I think it has maybe about 200 things on it now, but just different examples, right? So I wanted you to be able to walk away with different examples in case you wanted to do something in your own library or in your own organization. And so I have links to some presentations that I've done, including the presentation here at the iSchool. There are lots of lesson plans and other types of programming that different libraries have been doing. There's a program that Harvard University Library did. There's another link to something that the librarians at Oakland Public did not too long ago. So there should be some really good resources that you can consult, and just, you know, to learn more, but also to get some ideas about how to really have good conversations with your patrons and students, to talk to them about not only fake news, but maybe a little information behavior, and really just critical thinking and encouraging them to be more critical consumers of information. So with that, I think we have some time for questions and answers, and I hope that this was helpful. I mean, we only had a short amount of time today, but just to be able to scratch the surface and be able to facilitate further discussion about this important topic.
Thanks, Nicole. We do have time for questions. We have about 15 minutes, so if anyone has some questions they'd like to ask Nicole, feel free to type them in the chat box now. Okay, it looks like Carrie would like to know, how would you answer people who say sources like Snopes, etc., are slanted and can't be trusted?
Yeah, I've heard that, and I've read articles about that as well. So I guess my quick response to that would be, then, you know, we can direct them to other sources. Right? If they don't like Snopes, maybe they like politifax.org, or maybe there's another site that they think is not as biased, or at least perhaps biased in a way that would make sense to them. in other classes and other things, I have directed people to the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, other government sites. So there are a variety of sites that we can use to kind of fact check, if you will. But yes, no one's going to like every source we have. So I would say try and direct them to another fact-checking source.
Great, thanks. Looks like we have quite a few questions popping up now. Mary Ellen would like to ask you about the Vanessa Toro graphic about different news sites and their biases. Where does she get her information from, and does she have a bias?
She has been accused of having a bias, yes, and so there's a very lengthy discussion on her original post about that and people suggesting other sources. So from what I could tell, this is just her own opinion and coming up with this particular graphic. So it is likely representative of her particular biases in terms of saying, this source is conservative, this source is liberal, right? So she did not crowdsource this information. So I would imagine that future iterations of this graphic will be crowdsourced. And I don't know that it will ever be free of bias, but will certainly have more input in terms of trying to categorize the particular sources that they're listing.
Great, thanks. Robin has a great question. How do you recommend we circumvent talking about politics? I work in a politically polarized area and would like to talk about fake news without addressing U.S. politics.
Yeah, think about the example I just showed you with the Vancouver Kiss couple, right? That's completely free of politics. There are a lot of pop culture examples. There are a lot of, like I've done other workshops where I have used video clips and still clips from even the MTV Movie Awards, right? Because you can always take a picture out of context or eliminate the video or things of that nature. There are also fake tweet generators, right? There are Photoshop pictures you can use of anything. There is even a program, and I can't remember the name right this second, but it is almost like the visual equivalent of Photoshop in the sense that you can have live video that is fake, right? You can have a picture of a person and digitally make it look like they're saying something else. So it's a mashup of video and audio, right? So to say, how do we look at all of these sources and things that are on the internet that can really mislead people and change sources of information? So to get back to the original question, you could use any number of examples in terms of how technology plays into fake news. How do you see it with the different pop culture sources, the gossip sites? So there are other examples certainly that we could use to kind of get to the same end goal.
Great. So Laura is wondering how you would define the difference between fake news and bias.
So it's a great question. So I think bias is something, in terms of how you look at information, how you might perceive certain information, whereas the fake news is perhaps bias put into action, right? Because you can hold particular biases and just consume information and think what you will about the information that you're being presented with. But the problem of fake news is that you're then putting it out there into the world, right? So I was reading something, it's a book called Blur, and I'll type that into the chat box, and it really is talking about the real digital divide that we have now is between the amount of content creators versus the information consumers. And the information consumers are not necessarily absorbing all of this content through a critical lens. So I see the fake news and bias as very related. It's just a matter of if you are actually putting these biases out into the world, if you will. But I think that they are very much related.
Great. Amanda is wondering which news station is the most notorious for fake news. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's a loaded question. I'm gonna take the easy way out and say they're all putting out fake news, which they are, just perhaps to varying degrees. But I think there's a lot of, like I mentioned earlier, this need to be the first, right? The first to break news and the first to cover a story. There was a political story that we don't necessarily need to get into the details about, but BuzzFeed put the story out and said, we haven't checked this. We haven't fact checked this. We haven't confirmed that it's true, but we want to be first. And they actually said it, which I think was a new dimension to it all. So I think just the need to be first and to need the need to be on the cutting edge of things. I think that some sources are kind of running down that slippery slope, but I think you'll find fake news just about everywhere at this point.
Great.
Yes, Stephanie, that was exactly it.
So this one's from Kimberly. How would you suggest a public library go about hosting a program to assist patrons in de-echo chambering their news feed?
I would, my quick answer to that is, if you hit that Pinterest page that I mentioned to you, definitely take a look at the program that Oakland Public Library put out. A colleague of mine, Amy Sunny, put on that program with some of her colleagues, and they have the worksheets that they use attached, the lesson plan, if you will, and they tied it to the resources, their databases, and their subscriptions that they had. And really were able to, have some examples of fake news and then say, and this is how you might go about doing some more research to see, if that information was true. So I would certainly say, do check out what some of the libraries are doing. I know there's another link for Arlington Heights, which is here in Illinois, and then there was another program, I believe, by one of the library systems in Illinois. So I would definitely say check out their resources. I don't think that we need to be recreating the wheel on this, but these are definitely conversations that can be happening in both public, academic, and school libraries.
Great. And then Betty is wondering if you have any suggestions for how we would combat the idea of the press as the enemy of truth.
Yeah, that's a hard one, because this is getting back into this idea of repetition theory, right? And we keep hearing this, and so I think people are starting to believe that mainstream press is the enemy. And I would suggest really getting back to that idea that information is about democracy, and we need information from all sources, whether we agree with it or not, to really maintain our democratic process and our democratic freedoms. Library and information science, we're all about information access, right? So perhaps this idea of the necessity to have access to all types of information, and then coupled with this discussion of fake news, I'm hoping that we can, get past this idea, that mainstream is the enemy, right? Because really what part of this is that people are saying that because they don't agree with some of the information or news that's coming out, right? We can agree with it, but it doesn't mean that information should then be censored or altered because it's not palatable to all parties.
Great. And then Kim has one. Was the iSchool program that you referenced archived, and could it be made accessible?
It's on the Pinterest page.
Thanks. It looks like we're out of questions. Oh wait, Stephanie just posted one here. No, she was just commenting, sorry. We have time for about a few more questions if anyone else would like to ask Nicole anything else. give everyone a minute to finish typing.
So the Pinterest page, if it is linked, if you download the PDF, you'll find the link on the slides.
Okay. Cecilia would like to know, how would you address students who label authoritative research as fake news or liberally biased because they don't agree with it?
Yeah, again, that's a hard one, right? Because we're getting again into this tendency of just saying anything I don't agree with is just fake news. And I think it's just a matter of trying to hammer in that conversation about, well, if you don't like this particular source, let's find another source, right? That could be just as credible, but perhaps they don't think has a particular bias. I mentioned the book Blur. There's also the Critical Field Guide to Lies by Levitin. There's another book called Unspun. And all of these give some really great tips on how to really not only address the fake news and disinformation, but really give concrete tips, really broad tips that will hopefully help us circumvent this, it's fake news just because I don't agree with it, right? And I think that there are just so many sources. Some of them are fake news, but there are lots of quality sources out there that run the gamut in terms of perhaps leanings or biases. And there are just different sources that we can point them to kind of circumvent, well, I don't like the New York Times, so I think they're biased, I think they're fake news, I'm not going to read it. Okay, cool, don't read that. But there are other things that we can point them to that they might be in more agreement with that will still provide some factual information.
Great, thanks. I think we're at the end of all our questions, and we're almost out of time. So with that, thank you, Nicole, for the awesome presentation today, and to everyone for joining us. This webinar will be available for viewing on programminglibrarian.org within a few hours. Thank you.
Thank you.